In a small town nestled between the gentle hills of North Carolina, there stood an old white house with a wraparound porch and a single warm light that glowed every evening just as the sun dipped behind the trees. It was a modest home, but it had a presence that spoke of stories, the kind you could almost hear if you stood quietly enough. This was the home of Maggie Ellison, an 81-year-old grandmother whose wrinkled hands still held the grace of someone who once moved with the rhythm of life itself. Maggie had lived in that house for more than 5 decades, ever since her husband, Robert, returned from the Korean War and promised her that they would never leave the land that had seen their first kiss. The years had passed like the turning pages of a well-worn book. Their children were born, laughter filled the rooms, photographs accumulated on the mantel, and time, that invisible storyteller, left its fingerprints on every wall and every creaking floorboard. Maggie's mornings followed a ritual older than memory. She would wake before dawn, the cool air brushing softly against her lace curtains, and head to the kitchen to brew a pot of strong coffee. Her hands, though trembling now, still measured the grounds with the same care she had shown when Robert was alive. The kettle's whistle was her companion's voice, the sound that began her day. Sometimes, as the scent of coffee drifted through the air, she would glance at the empty chair across the table and whisper, "Morning, Robbie," just as she had for years after he passed. The neighbors often said they could see her sitting there by the window, her hair silver under the sunlight, and they admired her quiet strength. But Maggie didn't think of herself as strong. She thought of herself as someone who simply remembered, because remembering, she believed, was a way of keeping love alive. Her son, David, lived 2 towns over with his wife and teenage daughter, Lila. They visited on Sundays. Bryn. Maggie did not open the letter again that night. Instead, she left it on the kitchen table beside the half-finished jigsaw puzzle she had been working on, a picture of a seaside lighthouse, its light forever shining over painted waves. The letter sat there like an unanswered question, its presence both gentle and unsettling. Maggie tried to go about her evening as usual. She watered her plants, fed the cat, and switched on her favorite old jazz station, but her mind kept circling back to those words, "I believe we may be family." It wasn't just curiosity that made her heart uneasy, it was the name, Grace Holloway, her mother. Grace had been a quiet woman, hardworking and devout, with eyes that held more sorrow than she ever explained. Maggie had grown up in a small farmhouse outside Raleigh, never knowing her father. Whenever she asked about him, Grace would only say, "He was a good man who couldn't stay." As a child, Maggie had accepted that answer. But as the years passed, she came to understand the silence behind her mother's words. There had been love once, yes, but also shame, loss, and secrets buried beneath the polite smiles of a small southern town in the 1940s. The next morning, after a restless night, Maggie sat by the window with her coffee and stared at the letter once more. The handwriting was delicate, almost old-fashioned, the kind of penmanship you rarely saw anymore. She turned the envelope over again, hoping for a clue, but there was no return address. Only a faint scent of lavender clung to the paper, the same scent her mother used to wear on Sundays. It was uncanny. With a trembling sigh, Maggie fetched her reading glasses and unfolded the letter again. This time she read every word carefully. "Dear Mrs. Ellison, my name is Clara Jenkins, and I am writing in the hope that you might be the daughter of Grace Holloway. I am conducting research into my family's history and recently discovered documents that suggest my grandmother and your..." The following Sunday morning dawned with a softness that only October could bring, the kind of quiet sunlight that filtered through amber leaves, warming the earth without haste. Maggie stood in her kitchen, stirring a pot of apple butter on the stove. The scent of cinnamon and sugar filled the air, mingling with the faint sound of church bells ringing in the distance. She hummed an old hymn under her breath, her heart light in a way it hadn't been for years. The events of the past week still felt like a dream: Clara's visit, the photograph of Grace and Ruth, the discovery of a family she'd never known. It was as though time had folded in on itself, stitching together the torn pages of her story. That afternoon, David and Lila were coming for lunch, as they did every Sunday. But this time, there would be someone new at the table, someone Maggie could now call family. She'd invited Clara and her children to join them. It had taken her 3 days to gather the courage to make that call, but Clara's enthusiastic yes had warmed her heart. Maggie wanted her son and granddaughter to understand that love doesn't always follow a straight line. Sometimes it circles back through generations, finding you when you least expect it. The house buzzed with quiet anticipation. Maggie set the table with her mother's old china, the same set she'd used only for special occasions. She polished the silverware until it gleamed, arranged a bouquet of late-blooming roses from her garden, and draped the tablecloth Robert had bought her on their 25th anniversary. The fabric was faded now, but it carried the scent of history, of laughter, birthdays, and candlelit dinners long past. By noon, the driveway filled with the familiar rumble of David's truck. "Mom," he called as he stepped onto the porch, balancing a basket of fresh apples. Lila followed, earbuds in, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Hey, Grandma," she said, rushing over to hug her. "Something smells amaz." Winter arrived quietly in Maple Grove, the small North Carolina town where Maggie Ellison's porch light had burned faithfully for over half a century. The trees that once blazed gold and crimson now stood bare, their branches etching patterns against a pewter sky. The air carried the scent of wood smoke, and the rhythm of life slowed to the steady pulse of falling snow. For most, it was a season of stillness, but for Maggie, it was a season of reflection and gratitude. The months since Clara's visit had passed in a whirl of joy and rediscovery. For the first time in years, Maggie's house was never truly quiet. David dropped by more often, sometimes bringing over old family albums or just sitting with her in companionable silence. Lila, whose world had once revolved around screens and social media, now spent her weekends with her grandmother, learning to bake, plant bulbs, and listen, truly listen, to the stories that had shaped their family. And Clara's family had become an inseparable part of theirs. What had started as an unexpected letter had blossomed into something deeper, a reunion not just of blood, but of hearts. One evening in December, a soft knock echoed through the house. Maggie, wrapped in her thick wool shawl, shuffled to the door and smiled when she saw Clara and her children standing there, bundled against the cold. "Surprise," Clara said, holding up a casserole dish. "We thought we'd bring dinner, and a few presents." "Oh, my goodness," Maggie said, laughing. "You'll spoil me." Inside, the fire crackled as the families gathered once more. The dining table, long accustomed to years of quiet, now overflowed with food and laughter. Lila and Sophie decorated cookies while Ben and David argued playfully about football. The sound filled every corner of the old White House, turning it into something more than a home, a living memory of love renewed. After dinner, they gathered around the fireplace. Maggie sat in her rocking chair, her cat curled.